Every school day, at exactly 12 o'clock, Mrs. Helen Carter stood behind the serving counter. For 28 years, she had served lunches at Brookfield Elementary School. 300 children, 5 lunch periods, hundreds of trays, thousands of smiles. Most people believed her job was serving food. Helen smiled whenever she heard that, because she knew lunch was rarely just about food. She couldn't tell you who had scored highest in mathematics that morning, or which class had the spelling test. That belonged to the teachers. Her world began when children picked up their lunch trays. She noticed who always chose the carrots before the fries, who asked politely for an extra spoon, who remembered to thank her before walking away. She knew who preferred chocolate milk, who loved tomato soup, who never touched peas. And, without ever trying, she knew something else. She knew who always looked around before choosing where to sit. One Monday, she noticed a new boy. Dark hair, blue backpack, carefully balanced lunch tray. He stopped for a moment, looked across the cafeteria. Every table already seemed to belong to someone. He smiled politely to himself, then quietly walked toward the smallest table in the corner. He ate alone. Helen smiled warmly as he returned his tray. "Thank you." "You're welcome." He smiled back. "See you tomorrow." "I suppose you will." The next day, the same thing happened, and the day after that. At first, Helen thought very little of it. New children often needed a few days, sometimes even a week. Friendships couldn't be hurried. But after 3 weeks, the same little corner table was still waiting, and so was Noah Bennett. 3 weeks is a long time when you're 10 years old. Long enough to learn the way to every classroom. Long enough to remember your locker combination. Long enough to know which teachers smiled the most. And long enough to stop feeling new. Every lunchtime, Helen watched the same quiet routine. Noah collected his tray, thanked whoever served him, looked across the cafeteria, then walked to the corner table, not sadly, not angrily, simply alone. The strange thing was, nobody seemed to avoid him. Children smiled when they passed. Some even waved. His classmates clearly liked him. Yet, every lunch, the same empty chair stood opposite him. Helen had learned something after 28 years. Children were usually kinder than adults believed. Sometimes, they simply failed to notice. One Thursday, as Noah reached the counter, Helen smiled. "I wonder if you could help me." Noah looked surprised. "Me?" She nodded. "I'm trying to remember everyone's favorite dessert." He thought for a moment. "Apple crumble." Helen laughed softly. "I thought it might be." "You did?" She smiled. "You always look happiest on apple crumble day." Noah laughed. "I suppose I do." The conversation lasted less than 15 seconds. But the next afternoon, as Noah approached the serving counter, Helen smiled. "Good afternoon, Noah. Apple crumble tomorrow." His face brightened. "I've been looking forward to it." It wasn't much. Just one familiar greeting. One adult who expected him to arrive. One place in the school where someone already knew his name. That Friday, Helen watched him carry his tray away once more. The same corner table. The same quiet lunch. She frowned thoughtfully. Not because Noah was unhappy. Because something didn't fit. Children who truly had no friends usually looked lonely. Noah didn't. He simply looked late. For the first time, Helen asked herself a different question. Not, why is Noah eating alone? But, why does he always arrive after everyone else? The lunch trays had long been washed. The cafeteria had become quiet again. Helen wiped the last table. hung her apron neatly on its hook, then slowly walked toward the school library. Mrs. Evelyn Ross looked up from her desk. The librarian smiled. "Helen, what brings you upstairs?" Helen smiled back. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Never." Evelyn closed the book she had been repairing. "What can I do for you?" Helen hesitated. "I've been thinking about one of the children." Evelyn immediately became attentive. "Noah?" Helen looked surprised. "You know him?" The librarian smiled warmly. "I know every child who loves books." Helen laughed softly. "I suppose that's true." She became thoughtful again. "I've noticed. He always eats lunch alone." Evelyn looked genuinely surprised. "He does?" Helen nodded. "Every day. For 3 weeks." The librarian frowned. "That doesn't sound like Noah." Helen smiled gently. "I don't think it's Noah either." A pause. "I think it's something else." Evelyn thought for a long moment, then suddenly looked toward the return cart standing beside the shelves. "Oh." Helen waited. The librarian sighed quietly. "Every morning, Noah volunteers to help me put away the returned books before lunch." Helen smiled. "I wondered if it might be something like that." Evelyn continued. "He's so careful. He makes sure every book is exactly where it belongs." Another thoughtful pause. "I've never looked at the clock." Helen nodded. "I have." Neither woman spoke for a few moments. Finally, Evelyn smiled. "I think I've accidentally made him late for lunch." Helen shook her head gently. "No, you've given him something wonderful to do." She looked toward the shelves. "We just need to help him do it at a different time." The next morning, Noah arrived at the library carrying another stack of returned books. Mrs. Ross smiled. "Good morning." "Morning." She waited until he placed the books on the cart. Then she said, "I'd like to try something different today." Noah looked puzzled. "Different?" She nodded. "When the lunch bell rings, I want you to go straight to the cafeteria. The books will still be here afterwards." Noah looked uncertain. "But I said I'd help." "You will." She smiled. "Just not during lunch anymore." He hesitated. "I don't mind waiting." Mrs. Ross smiled kindly. "I know." A gentle pause. "But I do." Noah looked at her for a moment, then quietly nodded. "Okay." That afternoon, Helen watched from behind the serving counter. Noah picked up his tray, thanked her as always. "Apple crumble tomorrow." He smiled. "I know." Then, instead of entering an already full cafeteria, he was one of the first children through the door. He stopped, looked around. Several tables were still empty. Before he had time to decide where to go, a cheerful voice called across the room. "Noah." A boy from his class waved enthusiastically. "We saved you a seat." Noah blinked. "For me?" "Of course. Hurry up before Ben eats your fries." Laughter broke out around the table. For just a second, Noah stood perfectly still, almost as though he wasn't quite sure he had heard correctly. Then, he smiled. A real smile. The kind Helen had been waiting 3 weeks to see. He carried his tray across the cafeteria, sat down. Within moments, the conversation had already begun. Helen quietly returned to serving lunches. She didn't watch any longer. She didn't need to. For several weeks, Helen quietly watched the cafeteria return to its familiar rhythm. Only now, one table had changed. The corner table was usually empty. Noah rarely sat there anymore. Not because someone had assigned him a seat, because now, he arrived while there were still seats to choose from. Children have a remarkable way of making new routines feel old. Within only a few days, it seemed perfectly natural that Noah belonged at Ben's table. They traded sandwiches, laughed over impossible mathematics questions, argued about football, shared desserts when someone didn't like what was on the menu. Nothing extraordinary. Exactly what 10-year-olds should be doing. One afternoon, Principal Laura Simmons happened to walk through the cafeteria. She greeted a few students, stopped to thank Helen. Then her eyes settled on Noah. He was laughing so hard, he nearly dropped his spoon. Laura smiled. I don't think I've ever seen him laugh like that. Helen looked toward the table. He always knew how. Laura looked puzzled. Helen smiled. He just needed to arrive a little earlier. Laura stood quietly for a moment. She had known Noah's name since his first day. She had welcomed him personally. She had visited his classroom twice. Yet somehow, she had never noticed lunch. The following morning, Laura visited the library before classes began. Evelyn looked up from the circulation desk. Good morning. Laura smiled. I've just learned something. Evelyn smiled knowingly. Helen? Laura laughed. Helen. The librarian nodded. I never realized I was making Noah late. Laura shook her head gently. You weren't. You were helping him discover something he loves. She looked around the library. We simply chose the wrong time. The two women talked for almost 20 minutes. Not about Noah alone. About every child who volunteered. Music helpers. Library helpers. Office helpers. Children who enjoyed taking responsibility. Laura smiled. I think helping the school should never cost a child the chance to belong. Evelyn nodded immediately. I couldn't agree more. The following Monday, a small change appeared on the staff bulletin. Beginning immediately, student helpers would complete their daily responsibilities during the final minutes of the morning lessons. Lunch break would simply be lunch. No speeches were made. No assemblies were called. Most children never even noticed the change. They simply enjoyed a few extra minutes together. Helen read the notice during her coffee break. A gentle smile crossed her face. She folded the paper carefully, then quietly returned to the cafeteria. There was soup to prepare, fruit to arrange. 300 children would soon be arriving. She never mentioned the notice to anyone. She didn't need to. Sometimes, seeing a problem clearly was enough. Others would take care of the rest. Spring arrived almost without anyone noticing. The playground grew louder. Jackets disappeared. Windows stood open during lunch. The school somehow felt lighter. One Tuesday, Helen stood behind the serving counter as usual. The lunch bell rang. Children streamed into the cafeteria. Then, she noticed another unfamiliar face. A little girl, perhaps 9 years old. New backpack. Carefully balanced tray. Exactly the same uncertain expression she had once seen on Noah. The girl stopped, looked around. Every table already seemed to belong to someone. Helen felt her heart tighten just a little. She had seen this moment before. Before she had time to think, another voice echoed across the cafeteria. Hey! The girl looked up. Noah was waving enthusiastically. There's room here. The girl hesitated. For me? Then grinned. Of course. We've still got one empty chair. The girl smiled. A little uncertainly at first. Then, with growing confidence, she carried her tray across the cafeteria. Within moments, the conversation had already begun. Ben was explaining the rules of a card game. Another child was asking where she had lived before. Noah simply smiled and passed her the basket of bread rolls, as though inviting someone new had always been the most natural thing in the world. Helen quietly served the next child, then the next, then another. She never looked back again. She didn't need to.